Tonight we're going to cover two objectives, the spread of Chinese civilization in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, as well as major political developments in Japan. The key facts for objective number 23, the spread of Chinese civilization in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, are actually quite simple to remember. China is the dominant political, economic, and social force in Asia during the Han, the Tang, the Song dynasties. And because of this dominance, Chinese culture spreads outside the borders of China and it influences its neighboring areas, such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. This, of course, is typical of any big dynasty or empire. Think of the Roman Empire and its spread and influence over North Africa, the Middle East, or, for example, the Islamic empires and their influence and spread throughout the Middle East as well as North Africa and West Africa. So China, same thing is going on. So the word Sinification itself comes from the idea that we often refer to China as Sino. So when we talk about the Sino-Japanese War, we're talking about the war between China and Japan, which comes later. And Sino comes from Sinai, which is what the ancient Chinese Greeks called China. So that's, for your reference, where the word Sinification comes from. So Sinification is the spreading of Chinese culture. So if a country becomes Sinified, it is taking on influence from China and resembling China either socially or politically, etc. So that's really all you need to know for objective number 23, is that Sinification is the spread of Chinese culture. Think of, for Hellenism, with the spread of Greek culture, it's very similar. Objective number 24, we're going to talk about political developments in Japan during the period of Sinification. So a little background on Japan. On most American world maps, Japan is all the way to the east. It consists of 4 islands off the eastern coast of Asia. So towards the northern end of China and out into the Pacific Ocean. It's relatively isolated because it is made up of islands and they simply have a cultural tradition of remaining isolated. And before 400 CE, we don't know too much about Japan. There's not a lot written about it, and so our time starts around the Han Dynasty as we study Japan after 400 CE. So there you see it's 4 islands, and off the coast you see Korea actually separating China and Japan. So we're going to jump back to a minute to feudalism in Europe. Remember we looked at our social structure in feudalism. Try to go back in your notes and double check and fill in the pyramid for feudalism in Europe. So if you look back in your notes, you saw that at the very top of the social structure is the king. And below the king is the nobles. And if we remember our connections we made between them, the king gives land and protection to the nobles. And below the nobles are the vassals. And the vassals receive land and protection from the nobles. And below the vassals, because part of their family, but not the head of the household, are the knights, who receive land and protection from the vassals. And at the very bottom are the peasants, or the serfs, who are tied to the land and work on it. Remember that being passed up, the hierarchy is loyalty, and service. So for the peasants, that's providing food. For the knights, that's providing their military service, etc. So the reason we brought this up is that the Japanese economic structure at the time is very, very similar. They also have their own form of feudalism, which we see develops anytime an isolated society has a power vacuum or no one who steps up and takes power. So in the Japanese economic structure, at the very top is the shogun, who is the chief general. The shogun is a military fighter. The daimyo are huge landowners, so they're very similar to our nobles. The daimyo are also powerful samurai. At this point, you should watch the video on samurai. It's 42 seconds long. But the samurai are the fighting class. So differences between Japan and Europe is that the samurai are higher up the fighting class, whereas the knights are almost at the bottom. They have to answer to the vassals and to the lords. So the samurai were very well respected in Japanese culture. Below the daimyo are the lesser samurai. And at the very bottom are the peasants and the artisans, so the skilled workers. So just like European feudalism, Japanese feudalism has codes of conduct. So the samurai have a code of bushido, and the knights in Europe have a code of chivalry. The difference in this is that chivalry stresses respect for women. It puts women on a pedestal, whereas the code of bushido does not do this. Women live harsh lives. For example, if their husband, a samurai, is dishonored, she often is also dishonored and sometimes had to commit suicide. So the women really had only the harsh effects of the code of bushido. The feudal structure in Japan also affected where and how much people worked, doing what jobs. So again, where you were in the feudal structure determined your job. So either you worked in the fields as a peasant or you fought as a knight or a samurai. Japanese feudalism followed the same land for loyalty approach. So the same land and protection being passed down and loyalty and service going up the hierarchy. Japanese religion before the influence of China is called Shintoism. So it's the Shinto, and it means the way of the gods. So you can infer, is it monotheistic or polytheistic? Shintoism, much like, for example, Taoism, worships nature's forces, which they called kami. So like many of our early religions, it is based in nature. It encouraged obedience and proper behavior. And the goal is to become part of kami through certain rituals. So think back to the religions we've studied. To which is this similar? So eventually the Yamato family steps up and claims emperor as a direct descendant of the sun god. So where have we heard this one before? A couple of different places. The Yamato clan will rule for many, many years in Japan. Japanese religion, take a look at this image. Who is this image? Where have we seen it before? Why might the structure be in Japan? What can you infer given objective number 23 and your readings? So you got it. This is the great Buddha of Kamakura. So it's a bronze statue of the Buddha. It stands on the grounds of the Tokokuin Temple. It is 13.35 meters, which is about 40 feet tall. It's the second tallest bronze Buddha statue in Japan. So we can infer that Buddhism spread to Japan. This is the Sinification element. In the 6th century, China increases influence in Japan. So Chinese Buddhist missionaries bring the religion, Buddhism, to the islands in 522 CE. Can you imagine what else other than religion these missionaries brought with them? And reminder, objective number 23, what is this process called? So it's important to note, though, that Japanese do not reject Shintoism. They merely practice both Buddhism and Shintoism, and it becomes Neo-Buddhism or Zen Buddhism. Japanese political development. So the ruling family is the Yamato clan. And the Yamato clan, as we said, ruled for a very, very long time, from the 5th century CE to modern day. And during the reign of the Yamato clan, Japan is majorly influenced by China, or Sinified. And in the 7th century, Prince Shotoku takes Chinese ideas of bureaucratic and legal reforms from the Tang Dynasty. They were enacted after he died as the Taika reforms. What you need to remember about this is the Taika reforms and their elements, not so much the name of Prince Shotoku. Also, there's an asterisk because ruling is a subjective word. It really depends. Think of the royalty in England. So more on that later. So Japanese political development, part 2. While the Taika reforms were modeled in some ways after the Chinese, the Taika reforms did not take all elements of the bureaucracy in China and the government structure. For example, in Japan, birth is extremely important. Your family is everything. So where you are born, what family you're born into, think of feudal triangle, that determines where you're at in society. So what part of the Chinese bureaucracy did the Japanese left out? They left out the civil service exams, the merit-based exams, because in Japan, which family you're born into matters more than how you do on a test. So they didn't take the value of the scholar bureaucrats, the scholar gentry that China valued. Instead, it was not a merit-based or meritocracy. It was based on birth. So in 794, the capital of Japan was moved to Heian, which is modern-day Kyoto. And Chinese influence starts to subside. There's a new Japanese identity that emerges, and the power of aristocratic families grows in this time. So our noble people are taking power over our leader. One of the most powerful families is the Fujiwara, and over several generations, the Fujiwara intermarry with the emperor's family, with the Yamato clan. And so the Fujiwara family holds real power in this way. They are part of the leading dynasty. So the emperor, who's in charge, remains a figurehead. So he still technically rules Japan, but again, rules is such a subjective word. So under Fujiwara, the arts are seen in more importance. So there's a great deal of poetry, and women are especially active in poetry. They find their way. And aristocratic families gain more and more power. And by the 12th century, Japan falls into to be continued. So using the information from your reading over the weekend and this lecture, you're going to do a little main idea practice. Think of the main ideas we make with our SSRWC notes. And so you need to provide relevant details for the main ideas given to you. So you're looking for relevant supporting details. So the first is because China was the dominant political, social, and economic force in Asia during the post-classical period. Chinese civilization spread to neighboring areas. So give us concrete evidence to support that idea. And Japan's relative isolation allowed a unique civilization to develop with only limited influence from other cultures. So we'd like to see a minimum of 3 main supporting details for the main ideas. And we'll go over this tomorrow in class. Once you finish your main idea practice, make sure you fill in the signification chart for Japan.